This session focuses on assessing affective behaviors in the arts. So we're looking at what are, first of all, the question might be, what are affective behaviors? The assessment of affective behaviors is generally a neglected area of assessment. But I think one can make the case that it's important in arts education. For instance, we do teach courses called art appreciation and music appreciation, and that, at least by those titles, suggests that we're concerned about valuing. And I think you can argue that valuing and the process of education influences how people value. Social studies, part of social studies seems to me is focusing on an appreciation for a certain type of government when one takes a civics class. So I do think art courses are part of their agenda. Part of our agenda is to teach, is to help children develop a positive attitude, an interest in, and an appreciation for the arts in all genres of arts. In considering the affective behavior, it's useful to look at an organization of the behaviors that was developed by Krathwohl in 1964. He divides behaviors of feelings, attitudes, and values into 5 different categories, which are ordered in a hierarchical way by how internalized they are. So if you're superficially engaged in music or art, you would be categorized maybe as receiving it. And behaviors, there would be certain behaviors that would be categorized in that way. And if you're really totally involved in an art form, then you actually would be characterized by it. That's level 5. And those levels in between show different kinds of levels of engagement. So that you'll notice that you have to be receiving, you have to be kind of listening or looking at to be aware that there's information. Sometimes you think of elevator music. If you're listening, there may be music in an elevator and you may not be aware of it, so you're not even receiving it. Responding would be more of an engagement in the art. It might be in music a case of maybe you're clapping your hands as you listen to something or moving to the music. Valuing, it seems to me, where you develop a clear commitment of some sort. There's some kind of action. Maybe it's you go spend some money on an MP3 recording, or you attend a concert. Organizing or organization suggests to me that you have some priorities, that you, for instance, I think one index of organization might be what MP3s you have on your iPod. What have you spent money on? What do you have there and what don't you have there? I think that would be a suggesting kind of priorities. What museums do you go to? Do you have memberships in, a concert series, or have you joined a museum? And finally, characterization. I would suggest all of you taking this class are probably characterized because you've chosen the arts as a profession. But you don't have to choose the arts as a profession to be fully immersed, I think, in the arts. So you could have people who, go to concerts 3 or 4 days a week, who have vast collections of, probably everything from, depending on their age, everything from hi-fis to tapes to cassette tapes to CDs and to MP3s. You walk in their home and they're an audiophile. Those are people who are characterized by a value for a certain area. Trying to determine people's feelings or attitudes towards an area are challenging. There are several approaches that one might use. One might ask people, what music do you like to listen to? What galleries do you go to? more, probably more open-ended questions, but they could be structured also. You might administer a questionnaire about people's behaviors related to the arts. We're going to talk in more detail about attitude scales, but attitude scales are another option. We can use something called projective techniques, which again, an example of that might be if you had $50 to spend in a record store, what would you buy? Or if you had $50 online, or if you had $50, what would you do with the money? We can also actually look at behaviors. Of course, that's sometimes more challenging to collect the data, but we can follow people around, see what they do. I've suggested in some previous work that there's a relationship between behaviors and verbal indicators of behaviors. What you actually do versus what you say you're going to do. And that's often a question when we're assessing people's feelings. In this little equation that's you see on the slide, I've suggested that behaviors, BH, are approximately equal to a behavioral indicator or behavioral intention. And that might be expressed as verbal behavior. Oh, I like classical music, but do you actually ever go to a concert? That would be the real behavior. Now, I'm suggesting that verbal indicators are equal to something I'm identifying as affective set. Now, affective set is a relatively stable attitude towards a particular object or event or an area. And in this equation, I suggest that your general value for something is influenced by environmental conditions, which affect the relationship between behaviors, behavioral intentions, and affective set. And so while you may really value techno music, or one of your students may really value techno music, whether or not they go to a concert might be influenced by if they have money to go to the concert, or if their friends are going to the concert, or if their friends don't criticize or critique techno music. So what I'm suggesting, there are a variety of environmental factors. Now, I also, I think, suggest that if one collects enough behavior, then one will find the true affective set, that environmental factors will cancel out, because sometimes you might have money to go to a concert and other times you don't. But long term, your general affective set, if we collect enough data, should be apparent. Now, there's an interesting book that was published now a long time ago by Webb and several other colleagues that look at different categories of affective behaviors. And so I'm going to review a few of those. They can include things like the physical characteristics of a student, like the hair length, as well as the characteristics of object which the student has direct control over. So one might consider the way one dresses, or, and you could see that, I think, pretty clearly with high school students. They dress in a particular way, and it seems to me they're showing their belonging to a social group, and often that allegiance to a social group is affected or is indicator of they listen to a certain kind of music, or they're interested in certain issues. An example, more specific example, might be art students walking around with paint on their jeans, and even physical kinds of signs like guitar players have calluses on their fingers. You can almost tell how much someone has practiced if they've developed those calluses or not. Another category that Webb looked at was expressive movement. And this category can be everything, but what are you looking at? I guess that would be a good indicator in a museum. Or on a football field, the physical position of a fullback might indicate the which way the next football play is going. There was a really interesting study I found in an ancient book by Gillian and Moore, which looked at the facial expression of college students as an indicator of how they felt about both classical and popular music. Literally, and it was done in 1927, literally they played phonograph records, and they took photographs of the students sitting in class and looked at their facial expressions, whether they were smiling or frowning. So movement, again, is something that things like hand clapping, foot tapping, are things that clearly can be looked at and observed if one is trying to look at affective behaviors that might indicate affective perspectives. They also suggest that physical location is a way to examine. Now, obviously, if you're in a concert hall or you go to a gallery, those are physical locations. Another possibility would be classroom. Like, if there's a classroom with the notion of an open classroom where students go to different learning centers, so where do they spend time at these learning centers? You know, which learning centers are they at? Even the notion of where they are in museums, you know, or do they spend time outside of school in certain places? Do they go to music stores? Well, I guess we might consider now, I'm not sure how we handle online behavior, you know, but what websites do they spend time on? I guess that might be considered physical, or maybe we need to add a category called cyber location. What people talk about is another indicator, according to Webb and his colleagues, about affective set. So what do people talk about in the during intermissions at a music concert? You know, do they talk about the stock market, or do they talk about the music that was played in the first half of the performance? Again, an example might be, do the kids talk about when you've taken them to a concert at a performance hall, on the school bus ride back, do they talk about the music, or do they talk about some other daily events? How much time you spend in a particular location might also indicate your interest or value. Again, an art museum is a really interesting example. How much time do people spend in looking at certain objects? So attitudes, which we're going to focus on for the most part for the rest of this slideshow, is a subset of affective behavior, along with things like feelings, emotions, preferences, and tastes. Attitudes we might consider feelings associated with a particular object. And then there are different strategies for measuring attitudes using attitude scales. There are three broad categories, or three different authors associated with these different scales: Likert type scales, Thurstone type scales, and Gutman scales. We're going to look at Likert scales primarily for the rest of this unit. Likert scales, another title for them, are summated ratings, have certain characteristics. They generally have a statement about a perspective towards the attitude, and you'll see some examples later. And then they have a response scale, and the response scale typically has an opportunity to kind of circle a verbal response, which might include which typically includes things like strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, or strongly disagree. And the number of items on the response scale can vary from 3 to 7. Again, with the notion that an odd number forces people, an even number forces people to make a choice, where an odd number of items provides a middle point where people can kind of hide, if you will. You don't have to always use strongly agree and disagree. There are other labels that people use, and you'll see some examples. Statements for Likert type scales should be short, essentially having one idea. They should include both positive and negative statements. That is done to avoid response set. That is, if someone begins and they start circling the first three and they feel like, oh, I strongly agree with all these, they just may go down the whole scale and respond strongly agree to each one. That's called response set. And so by randomly ordering statements and including both positive and negative statements on the scale, one is able to ask the respondent or expects the respondent then to read each item carefully, and that's kind of what you want. You want them to attend to each item. The item should be clearly positive or negative, and I would suggest, although some scale constructors would suggest that it should be 50-50, I would suggest probably no more than a third of the items should be negative. But you should have, to the best of your ability, include a third of the items. And the scale should include a range of different possible attitudes towards the area. If you're doing research in an area and you have some sense about what people's attitudes are, then you might, in a sense, generate items intuitively. That would be one approach. You write them yourself. Another way to do this might be to, do a library search. Also, a good way, I think, is to ask people who you're interested in sampling. So if you were going to develop, you'll see a scale later on in this slideshow, that if you're going to try to determine principals' attitudes towards the arts, you might have some conversations with principals, asking them about, how they feel about arts in the curriculum. Or you might ask them to write a short statement. And then you might use those essays or statements, statements or sentences from those essays or statements in your Likert type scale. Likert type scales can be administered in a variety of ways. They can be administered in person. More and more assessment is being done online, so one could distribute them electronically, or one can do it by phone. Typically, attitude scales are not thought to be as reliable as other scales, so usually we would report the results as a group rather than individuals. So once again, if we're thinking about attitudes of principals towards the arts in the school curriculum, we might report by groups of principals, maybe principals in urban schools versus principals in suburban schools, but we don't think attitude scales are reliable enough to report them, to report data for an individual principal. Here's an example of a attitude scale that was developed at TC, administered to people attending the Summer Principals Academy in 2007. And I think you can read at least the statements in the green part of the slide. And you can get a sense, this is actually the culminating data sheet, so the numbers in the columns actually represent how many principals responded in a particular way. So if you look at item number 5, the music program is one of the first programs to be cut when budget cuts are necessary. You can see there's a fair amount of spread. Nobody kind of strongly disagreed with that, but at least some people disagreed. There were several people that clearly, there were 3 people that agreed and 3 people that strongly agreed and 4 people that agreed. Here's an attitude scale that was given to teachers who, I think these were probably classroom teachers, who had been given a guide to help their students prepare for a concert visit. And so you can see here's attitudes towards how well this guide was designed. You can see both positive statements, like in number 1, the guide was well organized, and negative statements, like in number 7 or 8. I don't recall specifically who this, what the population was for this groups. It might have been a general audience, maybe parents. You can see like something like number 5, the arts are very important to a child's education. Or number 9, learning in the arts can improve a student's self-esteem. It seems to me that it was maybe a general population of teachers or parents finding out their general perspective on the arts. So similar to the principals survey, but not exactly. This survey was given to students. I believe they were middle school students, and it was after they had had a in-school, but not an in-school volunteer instrumental music program. It looks like it focused, I think it was actually, the title of it was Winds and Brass Initiative, so that's what those are the instruments it focused on. And you can see we were trying to look at both their general perspective towards playing instruments, as well as how much they learned, as well as some comments about their instructor. So you can see number 4 looks at the instructor. Number 6 kind of looks at, progress. Number 10 looks at the instructor. You get a different sense. We're trying to look at different dimensions of this program. This was a questionnaire developed to give to a young group of children that participated in a children's choir we had, it looks like in the late 80s here at the college. So these were probably 4th graders, maybe 5th graders. Notice that the scale is only 4 options. You can see they're not using SA, A, NN, D, or SD. So they're using words, and there are only 4 options. Typically we recommend for younger students fewer options, as few as 3. This refers to people who were in a band or orchestra. That was the population. Here we have 6 options. You can see they're defined up above, forcing people to make a choice, no neutral. Both positive and negative, not enough popular music was played, so we're looking at repertoire. There was too much emphasis on marching band. So a variety of issues. The instructor was overcritical of everything the students did. So both the kind of instructor, the repertoire, and maybe the general, instructor's perspective. This was designed for elementary school children. The numbers on the left are actually data points. It was trying to get a general sense about their, again, music kind of sensitivity, appreciation. We called it affective levels when we collected this. When one constructs an attitude scale, like a Likert type scale, there is a way that one can determine what items are good and what items aren't so good, and it's called an item analysis procedure. And for those of you who choose to, for your second project, to do an Likert type scale, this would be a procedure you would follow to analyze the items. First, you would need to establish what we might consider criterion groups. Who are the people who took your test that have really positive attitudes, and who are the people who took your test that really have negative attitude towards whatever you're assessing? It could be a group of principals that really have a positive attitude towards the arts, or a group of principals that really have a negative attitude towards the arts. Now, typically we use what I'm calling here an internal criteria. So what we would do in those cases is we would take those who got the highest total scores on the test, demonstrated the most positive attitudes, and compare them with those who got the lowest scores on the test. But you could use an external criteria. Like you could look at school art programs, and assuming that they were exclusively determined by the principal, so they certainly are somewhat, you could choose principals that had strong arts programs in schools that had strong arts programs and principals in schools that had weak arts programs, and use them to as an external criterion for developing your item analysis. We're going to use an internal criterion, though. So the internal criterion, if you're using the total test scores, you would typically select the highest group and the lowest group by the proportion of your total population that got the highest score. So let's say you administered to 15 people. So I would choose then as my highest group the 5 highest scores, and I would choose as the lowest group the 5 lowest scores, leaving out those 5 in the middle who were more similar to each other. You know, if you had 10, if you administered to 10, I probably would choose the 3 highest versus the 3 lowest. If you administered to 20, I would probably do actually 5 and 5, since 5 is an easy number to divide by. If you had 30, I'd probably do something like 6 and 6, or, you know, in other words, something between 25 and 33% of the total group that you administered the test to, or the attitude scale to. In this case, for example purposes, we're using the high group has 5 people and the low group has 5 people in it, based on their total score. What we do now is to develop a statistic called Dmax, the maximum discrimination method. So what we do is a little equation up here. What we do is we determine what would be the, in order to determine Dmax, we use what we actually observe the high group and low group performed, how they performed, versus what would be the maximum discrimination, what would happen if they had the maximum discrimination. So we're looking at an example here where we have a sample of a 5-point response scale, and the item, let's say, is a positive item, which says simply, I love classical music. So what we have below in this little grid is the actual responses, the D observed, of this hypothetical population that we administered this attitude scale to. So in the high group, we had 3 people who strongly agreed with the item and 2 people who only agreed with the item. And in the low group, we have 1 person who agreed, 1 person who neither agreed nor disagreed, 1 person who disagreed, and 2 people who strongly disagreed that they loved classical music. Now, so that's the D observed. To calculate the Dmax, we said, well, what would happen if this item was working perfectly? That would mean all the people in the high group strongly agreed, and all the people in the low group strongly disagreed. So this would be kind of a theoretical notion. The idea, if this item was working perfectly, what would be the maximum discrimination? And you can see in the second chart, we've now assigned numbers, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's a positive item, therefore if you strongly agree with a positive item, it's worth 5 points. And only 1 point if you strongly disagree. So we can see this would be the high group and low group operating at its maximum. So theoretically, then the maximum possible points the high group could get, because there are 5 people in it and they all strongly agreed, these are the sentences at the bottom of the slide, that would be 25 points. And the low group, there are 5 people in it, and the lowest score they could get is 1 point. So they would get 5 points totally. Now to calculate the Dmax, it's actually the high group minus the low group. And so you'll see on this slide, Dmax, the D maximum is high group total minus low group total, or Dmax for this particular, or for all the items on this test, would be 20. So what we want to do now is compare what we observed with this Dmax. And for every item on the test, because we've got 5 people in our comparison groups and it's a 5-point scale, you don't have to calculate Dmax for every item. It would be the same. What you do have to calculate is the D observed for every item. So now we're calculating the D observed. You can go back a couple of slides and see these are the numbers that were represented there. So the high group score would be 3 people who chose 5 plus 2 people who chose 4. So 3 times 5 is 15 plus 2 times 4 is 8, so that's a total of 23. The low group score is a little more complex, but if you just follow that low group score paragraph, you'll see 1 person times 4 plus 1 person times 3 plus 1 person times 2 plus 2 people times 1. That equals 11 points. So to calculate our D observed, we do the same thing we kind of did with the D max. We take the high group and subtract the low group from it, the low group total from it, and in this case, or at the bottom of the page, it shows you that 23 minus 11 is 12. So going back to our original formula on how we calculate the discrimination, we take the D observed, which in this case is 12, minus, or divided by, excuse me, the D max, which for all the items on this particular test will be 20. So it's 12 over 20, or 3 over 5, and we report these as decimals. It's 0.6. That's on a from 0 to 1, actually from a -1 to a 1 scale. So this actually discriminates pretty well. It's a good item, in other words, in terms of distinguishing between the high group and low group. Now, these really can be done pretty quickly by hand. For if you have a 30-item test, the D max, the denominator, is always going to be 20 in this particular example. And then you just have to really do the subtraction for the D observed and then do that division. It's really you certainly can do it with your calculator on your cell phone, but many of these could be done probably in your head. Now, in addition to the discrimination index for each item, it's traditional to calculate the item mean. Now this shows an example of where the test was administered to 15 people. And on a particular item, let's say the item that we just talked about, I love classical music. These are the responses we got. So one person, the first person, person number 1, agreed, so they got a 4. The person number 2 neither agreed nor disagreed, they got a 3. So follow the numbers. Person number 3 got a 5. They strongly agreed. Person number 4 disagreed. They got a 2, etc. So we have all these 15 people that took it, and those are their responses after they've been scored, and they total 52. So in order to get the item mean, you simply divide the number of people that responded to the item by the total item score, the total of the item scores, which in this case, you can see the division calculation below. It's 3.46. A 3 would be kind of a neutral item. So this is a slightly positive item. The mean is more positive than negative. And this is how you'd report, you develop a report. This is actually the Principals Academy data, which looks at the different item means and how well they discriminated. And you'll notice on the far right-hand column, there's an asterisk next to some of the items. Those did not have good discrimination. And so we might think of revising them. In fact, item number 8 had a negative discrimination. That meant more people who had in the low group actually felt more positively about that item than people in the high group. So that would definitely need revision. Generally, when we're looking for D max items in order to decide if they're good or bad, we want items to have D max of 0.2 to 1. And then in terms of the mean, a range of item means is desirable. And so if you go back to that other chart, you can see that items 2, 3, 6, 8, 9, and 14 needed revisions. That's actually not too bad. You know, you're doing this for the first time. You don't really have a good sense of the population. And certainly if you wanted to do, you wanted to use an attitude scale for a research project, you would definitely want to go through several revisions. So the idea that there are several items that need revisions is not surprising, nor, that's part of what one would expect. Finally, when you write your report, if you develop an attitude scale, you would write some commentary about the revisions that would look something like this. And this is again taken out of this report from the Principals Academy. And you can see there's some attempt to explain but also the notion, if the group is, with the explanation, if you look at the last couple of lines, suggests that the group is kind of homogeneous, and therefore we're not able to discriminate very well. So maybe what we would do, maybe we'd be more successful if we use some external criteria. That is, we gave the attitude scales to principals in schools that don't have much art, and gave it to other principals in schools that had a lot of art, and maybe the discrimination would be better for that population. So that concludes the presentation on affective domain, and if you have questions, certainly email me or come in and let's talk.